Have you ever had that strange feeling of not knowing who you really are anymore? As if everything you believed you were, your name, your role, your image, was starting to crack, and you couldn't stop it. That moment when something inside you collapses, but instead of seeing it as a loss, a silent voice whispers, "Finally." What if what you call a crisis, a confusion, or even a temporary madness was not a failure, but an initiation? What if the death of your ego was not the end of you, but the necessary passage towards the truth that you have always hidden? This is not an abstract concept. It is a real event, biological, psychic, and spiritual, where the mind ceases to rule and consciousness takes over. In this video, we won't be talking about beliefs or dogmas. We'll be talking about inner awakening, that moment when your brain, your soul, and your story stop fighting and finally unite. Stay until the end, because understanding the death of the ego means understanding how to be reborn to oneself, without masks, without fear, without lies. There comes a time in life when everything you thought you were begins to crack, not because you wanted it, but because something inside you stopped believing it. The roles you played, the masks you wore, the truths you clung to. Suddenly, nothing rings true. You feel like this you show the world, is just a construct, a facade you've perfected to be loved, accepted, or simply to keep from disappearing. What most people call a crisis is often nothing more than a planned spiritual demolition. It's life knocking at the door of the lie you've been living for too long. And even if your mind resists, even if your ego clings on, the crack widens. Because what you hide from yourself never disappears. It's waiting for its time to resurface. Your ego, the mental structure you've mistaken for your being, was shaped to survive, not to awaken. It learned to protect you from rejection, from emptiness, from the feeling of not existing, but it did so at the highest cost, that of your truth. And when the soul can no longer bear this dissonance, it triggers what the ancients called the dark night of the spirit, a moment when everything collapses, when direction is lost, when even your own voice becomes foreign. But it is there, precisely in this disorientation, that something more real begins to breathe. It's not the destruction of your identity, it's its deactivation. What you take for an end is only the moment when your mind frees itself from its character. You didn't fail to be yourself, you simply stopped playing a role. And it's painful because your nervous system doesn't differentiate between the falling of a mask and actual death. It panics, it clings, it wants to reconstruct what it knows, but there are truths that can only appear after the collapse. When you have nothing left to defend, nothing left to prove, that's when you finally discover what remains when everything goes. Naked consciousness, the silent observer behind the chaos. This is where real life begins. Not the one you tell, but the one you feel. Without filter, without form, without fear. For a long time, ego death was considered a mystical idea, an experience reserved for the wise or the meditative. But today, science is beginning to put words and even images to this phenomenon that the soul has always known. What spiritual masters described as the dissolution of the self is now observable in the human brain. When an individual experiences deep surrender, meditation, trance, conscious breathing, or even guided psychedelics, something extraordinary happens. The default mode network, or DMN, goes into a state of rest. This network is responsible for that inner voice that comments on everything, compares everything, judges everything. It is the incessant narrator who says, "I am not enough. They will reject me. I must remain in control. When this activity decreases, a door opens. The mind ceases to be the command center, and consciousness resumes its natural role, that of observing without identifying. Researchers speak of an increase in neural connectivity. The regions of the brain that previously did not communicate begin to harmonize, to dialogue. It is an internal orchestra that improvises freely without a tyrannical conductor to lead it. This phenomenon is sometimes described as an entropic state, not chaotic in the destructive sense, but creative. The brain explores, expands, and connects the fragments of self that fear had separated. And this is where science meets ancient wisdom, because this state of expanded consciousness is not a disorder, but a return to the natural order, that of a mind at peace with itself. People who go through these experiences often report a paradoxical feeling. On the one hand, a total loss of control. On the other, absolute peace. As if the intelligence of life, greater than thought, was finally taking over. Carl Jung, long before neuroimaging, had a premonition of this. He said that the collective unconscious acts as a matrix of balance. When the ego dissolves, the psyche attempts to reorganize itself around a deeper axis, the self. Today, MRIs only confirm what he intuitively knew. What we call ego death is not a pathology. It is a reset of consciousness. The brain does not destroy itself. It repairs itself. And what science observes, spirituality understands. When the I disappears, the being finally begins to see. Carl Jung never saw ego death as destruction, but as metamorphosis. For him, human beings only become complete by confronting the areas of their unconscious that they have always fled. The ego is not evil. It is the temporary tool that allows consciousness to navigate matter. But it becomes a prison as soon as it believes it is the master. Jung called this passage the process of individuation. A simple word, but an immense journey. It is the road that leads from the social person, shaped by fear, education, the need for approval, to the self, that inner space where all contradictions are reconciled. And this journey always begins with a collapse. Ego death isn't a punishment, it's an invitation. An invisible hand that rips you away from who you thought you were, forcing you to become who you truly are. Jung said, "What you resist persists. What you accept transforms. As long as you fight the loss of your mask, you remain trapped by it. But as soon as you accept its end, you open yourself to a larger reality." This moment is often accompanied by confusion, dizziness, and loneliness. It is the desert between two worlds, that of the mind and that of the soul. But if you cross without fleeing, something radical happens. The center of gravity of your being shifts. You no longer live from your image, but from your presence. You no longer react out of fear, but out of understanding. Modern neuroscience speaks of neuroplasticity. The brain has the ability to reorganize itself, to recreate new pathways after a shock. Jung, for his part, spoke of psychic rebirth. Two different languages, one truth. When the ego collapses, the human mind becomes malleable. Old patterns, wounds, unconscious repetitions lose their hold. You no longer think from the past. You perceive from the present. Jung compared this process to alchemy. The lead of the ego, heavy, rigid, controlling, is melted by the fire of consciousness until it becomes gold. But this transmutation requires courage and honesty. Because before being born to the true self, one must dare to die to the false. And it is only by accepting this symbolic death that the soul resumes its natural place, that of the silent guide, the eternal witness behind all roles. the mind understands, but it is the body that heals. We can read books, meditate for hours, analyze our wounds. If the body doesn't participate, the transformation remains incomplete, because the ego, before being an idea, is a physical tension, a nervous contraction. It lives in the held breath, in the clenched jaw, in the shoulders that carry the world. And when it collapses, the body too must learn to breathe again. The death of the ego releases memories that the mind had buried. Emotions resurface: sadness, anger, fear, sometimes without explanation. The nervous system, deprived of its bearings, seeks to regain balance. This is a necessary phase. Authentic spirituality is not an escape upwards, but a descent into the flesh. For the body never lies. Where the mind conceals, the body reveals. Where thought is agitated, the body knows. The ancients already knew this. Every transformation must go through movement, breathing, presence. Somatic work isn't a modern trend. It's a forgotten wisdom. It's about listening to the body's language, not to tame it, but to let it speak. Moving, shaking, breathing deeply, shouting in a safe space, walking barefoot on the earth. These are all simple acts that tell the nervous system, you are safe now. This signal is essential. Without it, the mind remains alert, trapped in an invisible vigilance. Carl Jung said that the soul speaks in symbols, the body speaks in sensations. When we give them back their voice, emotions cease to be enemies. They become messengers. Anger becomes a boundary. Fear becomes guidance. Sadness becomes an opening. Integration is not about understanding what you are experiencing. It is about feeling it until you are freed. When the body releases fear, energy begins to flow again. Breathing becomes deeper, thoughts clearer, presence more stable. This is when the mind and body stop fighting each other. They begin to cooperate. And it is in this union that the spiritual is embodied. True ascension is not about leaving the body, but about returning to it fully, because in it, everything is written: your past, your wisdom, your truth. The body is the temple where the soul learns to dwell. And without this return to the flesh, there is no lasting awakening, only fragments of rootless experiences. When the mask falls, there is no emptiness left. There is you, not the you shaped by the past, nor the one others have defined, but the naked, silent, awake consciousness. What you thought was the end turns out to be only the beginning. Because after the death of the ego, life doesn't stop. It begins again, but in a different tone, slower, truer, deeper. This is where the union begins. Not a romantic or mystical union in the usual sense, but an inner reconciliation. The mind stops fighting against itself. The body is no longer a prison, but an instrument. The heart becomes the center again. You no longer try to understand life. You listen to it. You no longer seek to control others. You let yourself be moved by what is. This simplicity, which the mind finds empty, is in reality the highest form of peace. But union after the fall is not a fixed state. It is a living practice. Every moment becomes an opportunity to remain conscious, to embody the truth without clinging to it. This is where Jung's teachings take on their full meaning. Man does not find light by imagining luminous figures, but by making darkness conscious. You then understand that light does not exist without shadow, and that peace is not the absence of conflict, but the presence of lucidity. In this new space, relationships change. You no longer seek to be understood, you seek to be true. You no longer wait for someone to see you, because you see yourself. And paradoxically, it is when you stop defending yourself that true connection becomes possible. Neuroscience calls this co-regulation, when two beings, safely close to each other, are in nervous and energetic harmony. It is the heart that heals the heart. Union after the fall is that moment when you no longer live from fear, but from consciousness. You're not trying to be spiritual anymore. You're just present. And in this presence, there is nothing more to prove, nothing more to gain, only to be. This is the maturity of the inner traveler. He no longer seeks the summit. He walks in peace on the path. For he now knows that true awakening does not consist of fleeing the world, but of returning to it, whole. If you've come this far, it's perhaps because a part of you recognizes this path. You haven't lost your identity. You're simply transforming it. Ego death is not a fall. It is a liberation. Proof that your soul is done with survival and now demands truth. So don't try to become the person you were again. Seek to become the one who observes, the one who feels, the one who lives fully in presence. Remember, whatever your ego fears losing, your soul has already overcome. If this message resonates with you, share it, talk about it, offer it to someone who is going through the same fog. And if you want to continue exploring the depths of consciousness, subscribe, not to consume more content, but to grow in consciousness. This trip is not entertainment. It's a rebirth. And if you really listen, maybe it starts now.